And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. As part of a policy of assimilation, the federal government banned the potlatch from 1884 to 1951. The government and its supporters saw the ceremony as anti-Christian, reckless, and wasteful of personal property. By the time the ban was repealed in 1951, traditional Indigenous identities had been damaged and the social relations disrupted. On today's Open Connection, Nalakwa O'Brien.
Galikasla, Daukla, Nugwa Nalaga, Gayuklan La Kwakwakiwak Get Ligwithdow, Kaukuna, Hinu Dikyan. So my ancestry comes from the Kwakwakiwak Nation. So the Kwakwakiwak has 18 tribes, and I come from the Ligwithdow tribe, and then the Giglegum clan of the Ligwithdow, and the Cowes-Dastas Eagle clan in Haida Gwaii. And then I'm also Irish and Scottish as well.
Where did you go to school? Tell me about growing up.
Where did I go to school? I was born in Alert Bay. And then and when I was in grade 2, we moved to Comox territory. So Alert Bay is Numgeese territory, another one of the Kwakwakiwak tribes. And then when I was in grade 2, we moved to Comox territory, which is another one of the tribes of the Kwakwakiwak. So I'm currently living in Comox territory.
When you went to school, did you have any plans on what you were going to do for the future? You know, anything like, college or trades or anything like that?
My life path really didn't start until about a decade ago. Well, the life path that I'm currently on. So my experience in school, I was sort of a walking embodiment of the impacts of our history. So really embodied the impacts of residential schools and colonization, really on a cellular level. So I was disconnected from the land, disconnected from my culture. I had a lot of shame. That 100-year period where our people were taught to hate themselves, I really carried that with me. So when I think I was 10 years old when I discovered ways of escaping this sort of internal pain that I was living in. And then when I found drugs and alcohol, that was like my escape from this internal pain. So my high school years were very much just, I was harming myself, really doing the best I could to cope with this sort of internal pain that I was living in. It was a pretty hard time actually in my life during high school and younger years.
You mentioned something that was really important is that you were disconnected from the land. Is that really important when it comes to First Nations and First Nations cultures?
Absolutely. When I think about the impacts of colonization, there's many, but I think one of the big ones that really impacted me was, in order to colonize our territories, we needed to be they put us on reserves and we weren't allowed to leave. And so that began the disconnection from land. And absolutely, like everything comes from the land, our language, our songs, our dances, the way we view the world. We have this intrinsic, inextricable connection to the land, and that was severed for many of our people during the process of colonization and residential schools. So absolutely, it is so important for balance and healing and wellness that we are connected to the land. And there's many Indigenous people who've never even been to their territory, and that's one of the impacts. So when I think about healing and wellness, it's very much connected to the land and the relationship we have.
In my path of walking and talking amongst First Nations, one of the things I kind of heard over and over again was that when alcohol and drugs are taken, that it causes a disconnect with the body and soul, and that person kind of wanders around. It sounds like that's what happened to you too, right?
Absolutely. So I believe that when we experience trauma, our spirit leaves us. There's a process that happens within our brain and our nervous systems when we experience something traumatic. And one of the things that people do as an adaptive strategy to survive traumatic experiences is abdicate from their bodies. And I believe that during that process of needing to dissociate, our spirit leaves us, and drugs and alcohol are a way of coping with that disconnection. And so healing through the land is a way of inviting that spirit back into our being.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. According to Dr. Michael Yellowbird, Dean and Professor at University of Manitoba, mindfulness is a spiritual practice that, when done regularly, can transform the fear, anger, and despair in us and overcome difficulties we encounter in our daily lives. Let us return to the conversation with Nalakwa O'Brien.
I was able to connect the dots between our history, colonization, assimilation policies in residential schools, connect those things to my experiences of being a young person, drinking and using drugs, self-harming, in and out of the psych ward, sexual exploitation. So connecting the dots between our history and traumatic experiences that many Indigenous people, that's a common thing that many of our people are living with. And then how culture and a connection to land can help us to heal. I've been really excited recently because there's his name's Dr. Michael Yellowbird, and he's put out this term called neurodecolonization, and that's really referring to the processes that happen in the brain and in the nervous system when we're engaged in our ancestral wellness practices. So when we're sitting in prayer, when we're sitting in ceremony, when we're engaging in those contemplative practices that our ancestors left for us, that was what our ancestors did to take care of themselves, to maintain that state of balance in connection with body, mind, and spirit. So that's basically why I'm alive today. I like many, what the leading cause of death for Indigenous people I can't remember the ages. I think it's 25 to 45. It's suicide. That's the leading cause of death for our people. And that is so jarring to hear and to say, even and that's something that I've struggled with since I was a little person. I started self-harming when I was 10 years old. And when I found out that the leading cause of death for Indigenous people within that age range was suicide, it's really heartbreaking. And so neurodecolonization, I've been really excited about that because that process of engaging in our ancestral wellness practices, that's what's kept me alive. Thankfully, I stopped using drugs, but I was still disconnected from the land and from my culture, from my identity. And those ceremonies that I've engaged in for the past 10 years, they've kept me alive and have helped to remove that trauma, release trauma into the land. And so it's super exciting that there's now a term that I can use for the work that I've been doing and delivering community called neurodecolonization. And so when we're engaging in those contemplative practices, so when we're sitting in ceremony, when we're drumming, when we're singing, there's chemicals releasing in our brain, dopamine and serotonin. And then it's also activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our body's calming response. So I never knew why I did those things. I just knew it felt really good to engage in those practices. So just super exciting that Western science is now studying our ancestral land-based forms of healing.
When was that point where you go, okay, I'm finally free of these outside vices?
So I think I was 2 years sober when my sister Megan O'Brien is my older sister, and she introduced me to weaving when I was 2 years sober. And cedar is our most powerful medicine here on the Northwest Coast. We refer to the cedar tree as the tree of life. because the survival of our people depended on that tree. And it's used in our most highest ranking ceremonies because of its incredible ability to absorb our energy, our emotional, spiritual energy, our thoughts. When we wear it, it provides us with a form of protection. So when I wove with cedar for the first time, when I touched that medicine started to help to take away the shame that had been bred into me through residential schools. And that was really the beginning of my journey to where I am now, which is engaging in land-based cultural practices for my healing. So I think it was probably about 12 years ago that journey started for me. And it was through my sister Megan introducing me to the beautiful medicine of cedar bark.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Cedar is the tree of life and is used by Indigenous people for protection, ceremony, and daily life. Making small, simple items such as a bracelet reminds us of the limitless physical and spiritual gifts of the land. Let us return to this conversation as Nalakwa shares what cedar means to her.
Cedar is sort of the it's a cornerstone to our culture, and it's also a cornerstone to my life. As you can see behind me, I've got a cedar wall behind me. There's just cedar everywhere in my home. It's a cornerstone to my culture and to my life. It's something that bonds me and my children. It's something that helps to strengthen my relationship to the land, to help me move along a path of decolonization. And then also what I see in community, I do a lot of community work. And so having kids share after a cedar brushing, the cedar took my stress away. The cedar took my anxiety away. The cedar made me feel calm, like that just is one example of how incredibly powerful that medicine is for our people.
And I guess you could say you took that to the next step because you did something that was kind of unique because you're offering these workshops to actually a very niche group that unfortunately is someone doesn't want to be part of, and that's the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, right?
I've got a workshop coming up that's hosted by the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and it's a provincial-wide program open to anybody who's been impacted by the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls epidemic. There's so much injustice. There's so much injustice in our society, and our women were targeted specifically during colonization because when colonizers came here and seen that our women were highly regarded, viewed as sacred life givers, the backbone of our culture, and the strength behind our chiefs were the glue that keeps our cultures together. And so in order for colonization to be successful, we needed to be taken from this highly regarded place and subjugated and marginalized and pushed to the edges of society. And how they did that was through the Indian Act legislation, gender-based restrictions to status. There's just so much injustice that Indigenous women face. And so my aunt went missing 50 years ago. And so that's a part of my desire to be a part of my work is, to help my family, try to gain some justice, but also just for anybody who's dealing with that level of injustice within that epidemic, like we need healing, we need ways of coping because there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of rage there that needs a healthy outlet. And so my hope with the workshop is that that can come to fruition through the work.
Now you mentioned this workshop you do. Is it just like an hour session, or is it over several segments? Tell me a little bit about it.
This workshop that I'm going to be offering is a 2-part series. So it's 2 sessions and they're both 2 hours long. The first session, we're really going to be talking about trauma and the impacts that trauma has on our bodies, minds, and spirits. And talking about like emotion regulation and dysregulation, holding space for our emotions, sort of like emotional intelligence skills for helping to understand how trauma impacts our bodies, minds, spirits, and nervous systems, and then exploring ways to cope or heal from those traumas. And then the next segment of the workshop, we're going to be utilizing weaving as a mindfulness practice to cultivate wellness. And so because Cedar has that ability to absorb our energy, emotional and spiritual energy, the invitation for families or folks impacted by the missing and murdered Indigenous girls epidemic is to cultivate wellness for themselves through the process of working with Cedar.
What was the reception you got from the Indian Residential School Society?
I'm working with Helen Knott from the society, and she's been super supportive, very engaging, and really excited. So we sort of share similar passions in terms of providing our community with tools, tangible tools that can be incorporated into our lives, because healing from trauma, it happens in the context of relationship. We don't heal from trauma in isolation. We heal from trauma in the context of relationship. And so that hopefully will be created through the workshop, but also there's tools that will be delivered. You can call them like emotion regulation or self-regulation tools. So it's really utilizing our breath and our bodies as ways to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, our body's calming response.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Breath is essential to life. From the first breath at birth to the last breath upon passing, you take about 500 million breaths, usually without even thinking about it. What you may not realize is that the mind, body, and breath are intimately connected and can influence each other. In this final segment of Open Connection, Nalaquah shares her healing journey.
And so for a lot of folks living with trauma, myself included, my journey healing from trauma has been, up and down. And so for myself included, one of the impacts of trauma is being like hypervigilant or just like not knowing how to calm down and be still and be slow, like just want to stay busy all the time because it's uncomfortable being still. And so these tools that we're going to be delivering are ways to utilize our breath and our body to calm our nervous system. And it's for myself, I've been in recovery for 14 years, and it was just this past year that I got to experience what it was like to feel safe within my own body. I had never experienced that before. I had a survival mechanism that I had utilized was disconnecting from my body because it wasn't a safe place to be. And so these practices that we'll be exploring are ways to utilize our bodies and our breath to possibly experience feeling safer within our bodies. And I'm just so excited because this work has really come into my life through an organization called Yoga Outreach. And my involvement with Yoga Outreach is where I started learning about all these tools and understanding trauma. And I was so excited about it because I'd lived with the impacts of trauma for so long, but not knowing. I didn't know. And so the curriculum that was offered through Yoga Outreach, it connected the dots. It's like, wow, this is so powerful. And I want this to be accessible to more Indigenous people. Because I think whether or not Indigenous folks had like a safe, healthy, securely attached childhood, I still think that we've inherited that generations of trauma on a cellular level. So I'm excited about these resources being accessible to our community.
And you've actually done something else too, is occasionally you put something out there where people are really, I guess, almost like a little raffle. And that's regarding some of your art. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it was actually a friend of mine that I used to play roller derby with. She loves mushroom picking, and she sent me a picture of a mushroom picking basket and asked if I could weave one out of cedar. And so she was the one who gave me the idea. And then throughout the process of weaving, so it's a backpack. It's a harvesting backpack. The process of weaving has been, the cedar is so happy. It wants to be created into something that can be utilized out on the land, creating something that you can take out onto the land to harvest medicine. And that's really decolonization. I think the more of our people who can build a relationship and experience the incredible healing power of being out on the land, being connected to the forest. So the baskets are really a way to support community members to get out on the land. And the raffle that I just did recently, there was well, maybe I'll show it to you. I've still got them here. So there's one for a parent or caregiver or, grandmother, whatever, anybody who's spending time with children. So there's one for an adult, and then there's one for a child. So just to support children and their caregivers to go out onto the land to help strengthen that bond, because that's another one of the impacts of our history is the breakdown of our family system, so that was the intention behind weaving those baskets, to support people to get out onto the land and strengthen their bond. Something I'm super passionate about, especially right now with the opioid epidemic that's happening. There's far more people in BC that are dying of overdose than that have died of COVID, but you don't see any of that in the mainstream media. Why? Because drug addicts are and alcoholics, or use, if you want to use those terms, people who use, I like the term people who are using substances to cope. That's the term that I prefer. They're doing the best that they can. They're not bad people. And I feel like people who use drugs are highly stigmatized and marginalized, pushed to the edges of society as well. And I really, people use drugs because it's a regulation tool. You're living with this internal pain. Drugs and alcohol and substances are a way to regulate our nervous system. And, they work great. They worked great for me for a long time. And then it starts causing harm and damage. And so drug addicts or people who use substances, they're not bad people. They're hurt people. People who have been hurt most times from early childhood trauma that didn't develop the tools or resources to deal with that trauma. And then drugs and alcohol become a way to regulate our internal state. So I just wish that there was more talked about, because right now, people who use drugs are dying at alarming rates, and there's no need for that. There's a safe supply of substances to avoid the mass amounts of people who are dying from overdose. I mean, my whole life consists of how do I heal? How do I stay on this path? How do I strengthen my identity? And I just think my experience is really common, I think. And so I'm super passionate about providing these resources into our community, because our communities need healing.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pichtel.